The morning of December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny crouches in the frozen underbrush, watching an American supply convoy roll past through the pre-dawn mist. His breath forms clouds in the frigid air. Around him, 24 of Germany's most elite English-speaking commandos wait in captured American uniforms, their faces painted to obscure their features. They are armed with American weapons, carry American rations in American packs, and have spent weeks learning to walk, talk, and even smoke cigarettes, like Americans. But Skorzeny's eyes aren't focused on the GIs manning the convoy. They're locked on the vehicles themselves. Compact, boxy, utilitarian machines that seem to crawl over the frost-covered terrain with an almost supernatural agility. Jeeps. 24 of them in this single convoy alone, each one carrying men or supplies or weapons with an ease that makes Skorzeny's jaw tighten. He has spent 3 years fighting the Americans, 3 years watching these vehicles appear in every theatre, in every role, in numbers that seem impossible. And now, for Operation Grafe, Hitler's last desperate gambit to turn the tide, Skorzeny has built his entire infiltration strategy around one critical asset: capturing and using American Jeeps. Not German Kübelwagens painted to look American, real Jeeps, because nothing else will work. Because after 3 years of war, every German soldier knows a truth that their generals won't speak aloud. The Americans built something better. This is the story of how Germany designed what appeared to be the superior vehicle on paper, produced it with Teutonic precision, and then spent the entire war desperately trying to capture the heavier, thirstier, more complex American alternative. It is a story about the collision between engineering theory and battlefield reality. About the moment when German soldiers, taught to believe in their technical superiority, confronted an industrial miracle that redefined what a military vehicle could be. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how this happened, we must return to 1933, to the Berlin Auto Show, where a rising German chancellor named Adolf Hitler stood before automotive engineers and outlined his vision for a motorized Third Reich. Hitler had studied the First World War intensely. He understood that modern warfare was no longer about cavalry charges and infantry marches. It was about internal combustion engines, about the capacity to move men and materiel faster than the enemy could react. The nation that could motorize its military most effectively would dominate the battlefield. Hitler commissioned Ferdinand Porsche, already a legend in automotive engineering, to create 2 vehicles that would mechanize Germany. The first would be the KDF wagon, the strength through joy car, later known as the Volkswagen Beetle. The second would be its military variant, a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle that could traverse the varied terrain of Europe while consuming minimal fuel and requiring minimal maintenance. Porsche delivered. By January 1938, before the Volkswagen factory was even completed, SS officers approached the company with specifications for a militarized version. Within 10 months, prototypes rolled off the line. They called it the Type 82. Soldiers would call it the Kübelwagen, the bucket car, for its simple, stamped steel bucket seats. The Kübelwagen embodied German engineering philosophy. It was efficient. Porsche's team had designed it with an air-cooled engine, eliminating the radiator that made liquid-cooled engines vulnerable to bullet damage and freezing temperatures. The engine produced 25 horsepower from its 985 cubic centimeter, displacement modest power, but carefully calculated to balance performance with fuel economy. Where the Americans would later field vehicles that guzzled fuel, the Kübelwagen achieved fuel consumption in the high teens of miles per gallon. The vehicle's engineering was elegant in its simplicity. It lacked four-wheel drive, a feature the Americans would consider essential, relying instead on rear-wheel drive, augmented by an ingenious technical solution. Porsche installed reduction gears in the rear-wheel hubs, which simultaneously increased ground clearance and improved torque delivery. The flat underbody, inherited from the Volkswagen Beetle's aerodynamic design, acted as a primitive ground effect surface. When the Kubelwagen encountered snow, sand, or mud, It didn't dig in like conventional vehicles. It slid across the surface like a motorized sled, using its own weight and momentum to maintain forward progress. German military officials tested the early prototypes rigorously. They took them to mountain passes in Bavaria. They ran them through the mud of northern Germany. They subjected them to the kind of punishment that would destroy civilian vehicles. The Kübelwagen performed admirably. More than admirably, it exceeded expectations. In head-to-head comparisons with four-wheel drive vehicles, including some early captured French military transports, the two-wheel drive Kübelwagen often outperformed its supposedly superior competitors in off-road conditions. The vehicle's specifications seem to confirm everything about German technical superiority. Weight, 1,540 pounds, making it nimble and easy to maneuver. Length, 12 feet. Width, just over 5 feet. It could carry 4 fully equipped soldiers with their weapons and supplies. The air-cooled engine meant it would start in Scandinavian winters and North African summers without the complications of coolant freezing or radiator damage. Maintenance was straightforward. The engine was accessible. Parts were interchangeable with the civilian Volkswagen production line, and field repairs required minimal specialized tools. By 1940, as Germany prepared for what would become the invasion of Poland, the Kübelwagen entered mass production. The vehicle proved itself immediately in combat. It navigated the difficult terrain of Poland's countryside. It performed well in Norway's mountains. When Germany invaded France in 1940, Kübelwagens served as reconnaissance vehicles for the armoured spearheads that would shatter French defences and drive the British Expeditionary Force to the beaches of Dunkirk. German soldiers praised the vehicle. Officers appreciated its reliability and low operating costs. The propaganda ministry published photographs of Kübelwagens in various theatres, presenting them as symbols of German engineering ingenuity, proof that the Reich could outthink and outperform its enemies, even in the mundane but critical realm of military logistics. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States Army faced an embarrassing problem. The most powerful industrial nation on Earth had no modern reconnaissance vehicle. The Army still relied heavily on horses and motorcycles for light transport and scouting duties. While Germany mechanized its military, the United States Army of 1939 remained partially tethered to 19th-century transportation methods. The situation was untenable. In June 1940, as France fell to German forces, the US Army issued a desperate request for proposals. They wanted a quarter-ton, four-wheel drive reconnaissance vehicle. The specifications were demanding. It had to weigh less than 1,300 pounds, carry a crew and equipment, traverse rough terrain, and be producible in large numbers. The Army gave manufacturers just 49 days to submit working prototypes. 135 American automotive companies received the invitation. Only 3 responded. American Bantam Car Company, a small manufacturer in Butler, Pennsylvania, struggling to survive the Great Depression, delivered the first prototype. Willys Overland Motors in Toledo, Ohio, submitted their entry next. Ford Motor Company, the titan of American industry, entered last. The Army tested all 3 designs at Camp Holabird in Maryland. Each vehicle had strengths and weaknesses. The Bantam prototype met most specifications but came from a company that lacked the production capacity for large-scale manufacturing. The Ford design incorporated clever manufacturing shortcuts but suffered from poor weight distribution. The Willys entry exceeded the weight limit but featured something the other prototypes lacked: raw power. Willys had installed their L134 engine, nicknamed the Go Devil. It was a flathead inline-4, displacing 134 cubic inches and producing 60 horsepower. Compared to the Kübelwagen's 25 horsepower, it was a brute. Army testers pushed the Willys vehicle through obstacle courses, up steep inclines, through water crossings. The Go Devil engine roared through every challenge. When loaded well beyond its rated capacity, a common occurrence in actual military operations, it kept going. In July 1941, the Army awarded Willys Overland the standardization contract. They designated the vehicle, the truck, quarter-ton, 4x4, Command Reconnaissance, or by its factory designation, the Willys MB. But soldiers and journalists had already given it a different name. At a demonstration in Washington, a Willys representative drove the vehicle up the steps of the U.S. Capitol building to showcase its climbing ability. A journalist asked what it was called. The driver replied, possibly slurring the military designation GP for general purpose, possibly referencing the character Eugene the Jeep from Popeye cartoons, a creature that could go anywhere and solve any problem. The name stuck. Production began in November 1941. By December 7th, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Willys had produced several thousand Jeeps. The attack transformed the production schedule from ambitious to impossible. The army needed tens of thousands of vehicles immediately. Willys couldn't produce them fast enough alone. In October 1941, recognizing the bottleneck, the army licensed Ford Motor Company to produce Jeeps using Willys' design. Ford called their version the GPW government, P for the 80-inch wheelbase, W for Willys' design. American factories went to war. Assembly lines that had produced civilian automobiles retooled for military production. By mid-1942, Willys and Ford together were producing one Jeep every 90 seconds. The vehicles rolled off the lines in staggering numbers: 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. By the end of 1943, production exceeded 300,000 units. The Jeep that emerged from this industrial mobilization was, on paper, inferior to the Kübelwagen in several measurable ways. It weighed 2,453 pounds, nearly 900 pounds heavier than its German counterpart. Its liquid-cooled engine required a radiator, adding complexity and vulnerability. It consumed fuel at a rate of 10 to 11 miles per gallon in field conditions, significantly less efficient than the Kübelwagen's 15 to 18 miles per gallon. Each Jeep cost approximately $738 to produce, compared to the Kübelwagen's lower production costs. But the Jeep possessed characteristics that numbers alone couldn't capture. That 60-horsepower engine provided enormous torque, 105 pound-feet, at 2,000 revolutions per minute. When a Jeep encountered an obstacle, it didn't finesse its way over like the Kübelwagen. It powered through. The four-wheel drive system, with its two-speed transfer case offering high and low-range gearing, meant the Jeep could crawl over terrain that would stop two-wheel drive vehicles, then shift into high range and cruise at highway speeds. The vehicle's rated capacity was 800 pounds of cargo, or 5 soldiers with equipment. In practice, soldiers regularly loaded Jeeps with twice that weight. They mounted heavy weapons, Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 37mm anti-tank guns, multiple rocket launchers. They welded armor plating to the front and sides. They strapped jerry cans of fuel, crates of ammunition, and wounded soldiers on stretchers. The Jeep's suspension groaned under loads that should have broken it, but the Go Devil engine kept pulling. American forces deployed Jeeps everywhere. They arrived in Britain with the first US troops in 1942. They landed on the beaches of North Africa during Operation Torch in November 1942. They splashed ashore at Sicily, at Salerno, at Anzio. In the Pacific, they rolled off landing craft at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at dozens of contested beachheads. By 1943, the Jeep had become the most recognizable American military vehicle in the world. German soldiers first encountered captured Jeeps in significant numbers in North Africa. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had been using Kübelwagen since the campaign began in 1941. The vehicles performed adequately in the desert, though the sand and heat tested them constantly. Then American forces landed in Algeria and Morocco, bringing with them thousands of Jeeps. The first time a German soldier drove a captured Jeep, the difference was immediately apparent. The acceleration was startling. The Kübelwagen's 25 horsepower required careful throttle management and patience. The Jeep's 60 horsepower responded instantly. Step on the accelerator and the vehicle surged forward with authority. The four-wheel drive system meant that where a Kübelwagen might slip or require a running start to climb a dune, the Jeep simply engaged low range and crawled up steadily. German forces began actively seeking to capture jeeps intact. A Kübelwagen was transportation. A jeep was a prize. Units that captured jeeps would often send them to the rear for official redistribution through the Wehrmachtswaffenamt, the Ordnance Bureau, that managed captured enemy equipment. But just as often, frontline units would quickly repaint the vehicle with German markings and press it into immediate service. Officers, particularly valued, captured jeeps for their speed and reliability. Word spread through the German military. Soldiers shared stories about these American vehicles that seemed indestructible. The jeep could ford rivers. It could be submerged with proper waterproofing kits and driven onto beaches. It could tow artillery pieces that outweighed it. Soldiers reported seeing jeeps that had been shot up, radiators punctured, body panels riddled with holes still running because the engine itself remained functional. The psychological impact was subtle but corrosive. German soldiers had been told they possessed superior equipment and superior engineering. The Kübelwagen was supposed to be proof of Teutonic technical excellence. But increasingly, when given the choice between their own vehicle and a captured American one, they chose the jeep. By late 1943, U.S. military intelligence conducted tests on captured German equipment. When they evaluated Kübelwagens taken in North Africa, their conclusions were diplomatic but telling. The German vehicle was simpler to manufacture and maintain. It was faster in some conditions. Its lighter weight and lower gearing gave it a slight edge in top speed on flat, hard surfaces. It was more comfortable for passengers than the jeep's cramped interior. But the report's authors also noted what they carefully didn't say, that in every practical measure of military utility, the jeep was superior. A 1945 U.S. War Department technical manual was more blunt. It stated flatly that the Volkswagen Type 82, the Kübelwagen, was inferior in every way to the American Jeep, excepting only the comfort of its seating. The manual's authors had the advantage of 3 years of combat data. They had interrogated prisoners. They had analyzed captured equipment. They knew what German soldiers actually thought of their supposedly superior vehicle. The truth became undeniable in the winter of 1943 and 1944, as Germany faced the reality of fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who possessed overwhelming material superiority. The Eastern Front consumed vehicles at a catastrophic rate. The vast distances of the Soviet Union, the terrible roads, the extreme cold, all of it destroyed equipment faster than Germany could replace it. The Wehrmacht was chronically short of transportation. Even elite SS Panzer divisions, supposedly better equipped than regular army units, had fewer vehicles than a standard American infantry division. Into this desperate situation came reports from every front about American jeeps. In Italy, German forces discovered that American supply columns included more jeeps than the entire German army had Kübelwagens. In France, after the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, German soldiers watched in disbelief as American forces seemed to have jeeps for every conceivable purpose. Jeeps carried infantry to the front. Jeeps evacuated wounded to field hospitals. Jeeps towed artillery. Jeeps served as communications platforms, mounting radio equipment and carrying signals personnel. Jeeps hauled ammunition and rations. There were so many jeeps that individual rifle squads often had their own vehicle, a level of mechanization that seemed wasteful, excessive, impossible. Some German soldiers began to believe that every American soldier had been issued his own personal jeep. It was an absurd notion, but the sheer numbers seemed to support it. The United States produced over 640,000 jeeps during the war. Germany produced approximately 50,000 Kübelwagens. American production exceeded German production by a factor of nearly 13 to 1. But it wasn't just quantity. It was what the quantity represented. When a German Kübelwagen broke down or was destroyed, replacement parts might take weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. German logistics were strained to the breaking point. When an American Jeep was destroyed, another one appeared within days, sometimes hours. American logistics seemed limitless. The Germans started modifying their tactics around this reality. When planning ambushes or raids, German units specifically targeted American jeeps for capture. A captured jeep was valuable beyond its utility as a vehicle. It represented fuel that didn't have to come from overstretched German supply lines. It represented parts that were actually available. It represented a machine that, unlike increasingly makeshift German equipment, had been built in a factory with adequate materials and proper quality control. Captured jeeps became so common in German service that the U.S. military began warning troops to be suspicious of any jeep in contested areas. German forces would use captured jeeps to approach American positions, relying on the vehicle's familiar silhouette to avoid drawing fire until the last moment. After significant incidents of this kind, American commanders issued orders to challenge all jeeps, even those appearing to carry American troops, in forward areas. The ultimate expression of German respect for the American jeep came in December 1944, with Operation Greif. Hitler had ordered a final offensive in the West, a desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The plan relied on speed and surprise. To maximize both, Hitler tasked Otto Scorzani, the SS commando who had dramatically rescued Italian dictator Benito Mussolini in 1943, with a special mission. Scorzani was to assemble a unit of English-speaking Germans, dress them in American uniforms, equip them with American weapons, and send them behind American lines to sow confusion. They would redirect traffic, cut communications, spread false information, and most critically capture and hold bridges across the Meuse River that German armoured forces would need to complete their advance. Scorzani called his unit Panzer Brigade 150. For months, he gathered personnel and equipment. The personnel were challenging enough. He needed men who could speak fluent English with American accents, who understood American military procedures, who could pass as GIs under close inspection. But the equipment proved even more difficult. Scorzani wanted American tanks, American trucks, and American weapons. Above all, he wanted jeeps. The operation required jeeps because nothing else would work. Scorzani couldn't use Kübelwagens painted to look American. The silhouette was wrong, the sound was wrong, the performance characteristics were wrong. Any American soldier would recognize the difference immediately. He couldn't use other German vehicles for the same reason. The jeep had become so ubiquitous in American rear areas that it was effectively invisible. A German commando in American uniform driving a jeep would be waved through checkpoints without question. The same commando in any other vehicle would draw immediate suspicion. Scorzani managed to assemble approximately 24 jeeps for his operation. Some were captured intact, others were pieced together from wrecked vehicles, cannibalized for usable parts. Each one was precious. The commandos who would drive them received special training. They practiced American driving habits. Americans drove differently than Germans, with different road discipline, different reactions to military police. They learned to ride with the casual posture American soldiers adopted in rear areas, rather than the upright bearing German military training instilled. On December 16, 1944, the German offensive began. Scorzani's commandos infiltrated American lines in their captured jeeps. For a brief period, the operation achieved its goal of spreading chaos. American soldiers reported seeing jeeps full of Germans in American uniforms. Military police began stopping every jeep, demanding identification, asking questions designed to catch imposters. The paranoia spread faster than the actual infiltration. Senior officers were delayed at checkpoints. Even British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's jeep was stopped and its tires shot out by overzealous American sentries. But Operation Greif ultimately failed, and the failure was partly due to the jeeps themselves. Scorzani had assumed, based on German military practice, that a jeep would carry 4 men. German military vehicles were operated at maximum capacity because transportation was scarce. But American practice was different. American jeeps typically carried 2 men, occasionally 3. 4 men in a jeep marked the vehicle as suspicious. Once American military police realized this pattern, they began opening fire on any jeep carrying 4 occupants in forward areas. The commandos caught wearing American uniforms were executed. The laws of war were clear: combatants captured in enemy uniforms could be shot as spies. 16 of Scorzani's men faced firing squads. The operation accomplished little beyond temporarily disrupting American communications. But what it revealed was profound. Germany's most elite special operations force had built its entire infiltration strategy around using American vehicles because their own vehicles wouldn't suffice. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured Wehrmacht generals and field marshals. The interrogations covered every aspect of the war: German strategy, tactics, equipment, effectiveness, leadership decisions. U.S. Army historian Hugh Cole asked these senior officers what they had thought of various American weapons and equipment. He asked about American artillery, American tanks, and American aircraft. When he asked about the Jeep, something shifted in the responses. These were men who had commanded armies, who had fought in multiple theaters, who had seen every weapon system, both sides deployed. And they told Cole that the Jeep impressed them more than anything else in the American arsenal, more than the P-51 Mustang fighter that had achieved air superiority over Germany, more than the M4 Sherman tank that had rolled through France, more than the industrial capacity that produced ships, planes, and weapons in quantities Germany couldn't match. They admired the Jeep because it represented something they hadn't been able to counter: the combination of adequate performance with overwhelming production. The Jeep wasn't the best vehicle any individual engineer could design. It wasn't the fastest, the most fuel-efficient, the most technically sophisticated. But it was good enough in every category that mattered, and there were hundreds of thousands of them. One German general articulated it simply. He said Germany had spent the war trying to build vehicles that could keep up with their panzer divisions. America had built a vehicle that could keep up with everything. The Jeep could support infantry advances, accompany armored spearheads, evacuate casualties from the front lines, supply forward positions, serve as a mobile weapons platform, and perform a dozen other roles as needed. And there were enough of them that losing hundreds or thousands to enemy action didn't matter. More will arrive tomorrow. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The question remains: how did this happen? How did a vehicle that was heavier, thirstier, more complex, and more expensive become so superior that the enemy preferred it to their own equipment? The answer lies in understanding the difference between engineering for specifications and engineering for war. The Kübelwagen was an exemplary answer to a theoretical question: design the most efficient light military vehicle possible. Porsche's team had optimized every parameter. They reduced weight to improve mobility. They used air cooling to eliminate vulnerability and simplify maintenance. They achieved remarkable fuel economy. They created a vehicle that, judged by the metrics of automotive engineering, was exceptional. But the Jeep was the answer to a different question: build something that soldiers can use to win battles. That question led to different design priorities. Power mattered more than efficiency, because soldiers carrying wounded men through mud under fire don't care about miles per gallon. They care about having enough power to keep moving. Durability mattered more than weight, because a vehicle that needs constant maintenance is useless when spare parts can't reach the front line. Versatility mattered more than specialization, because combat conditions are unpredictable, and a vehicle that can only perform reconnaissance is inadequate when circumstances demand it become an ambulance, or a weapons carrier, or a supply transport. The Jeep's 60-horsepower engine was the key. That power meant the vehicle could carry loads far exceeding its rated capacity. American soldiers regularly loaded Jeeps with 1,200 or 1,500 pounds of equipment, double the official 800-pound limit. The Go Devil engine strained under these loads, but it pulled them. German soldiers who drove captured Jeeps reported being shocked by the vehicle's willingness to keep working under conditions that would have destroyed a Kübelwagen. The liquid-cooled engine was actually an advantage, not the liability it appeared. Yes, radiators could be punctured by bullets or shrapnel, but liquid cooling provided more efficient heat management than air cooling, especially under sustained high-load operation. When a Jeep's radiator was damaged, soldiers could often patch it with sealant or even bar soap, add water, and keep driving. The cooling system's vulnerability was real, but manageable. The four-wheel drive system transformed the Jeep's capability. The Kübelwagen's clever two-wheel drive design worked well in many conditions, but it had limits. Sand, mud, snow, steep inclines in these conditions, the Kübelwagen's rear-wheel drive often struggled. It could usually get through, with skill and patience, but not always. The Jeep, with power going to all four wheels and a low-range transfer case available when needed, simply didn't get stuck as often. And when it did, it was light enough that four soldiers could manhandle it free. But beyond the technical specifications, beyond the performance characteristics, the Jeep represented something else. American industrial philosophy translated into steel and rubber. German engineering emphasized optimization and efficiency. American engineering emphasized adequacy and volume. The German approach produced technically superior individual units. The American approach produced enough adequate units to overwhelm any technical advantage. Consider the numbers again. 600, 47,800, 70 American Jeeps versus approximately 50,500 German Kübelwagens. That disparity meant that even if the Kübelwagen had been superior in every measurable way, which it wasn't, it wouldn't have mattered. There were 13 American vehicles for every German one. American forces could lose Jeeps to mechanical failure, to enemy action, to accidents, and still have transportation to spare. German forces had to husband their Enschim, Kübelwagens carefully, because replacements might never come. This was the reality that German soldiers faced daily by 1944. They watched American units operating with a casualness about equipment that seemed incomprehensible. Americans would abandon damaged Jeeps rather than spend time repairing them because new ones would arrive in the next supply convoy. Germans had to repair every vehicle, scavenge every part, because German supply lines couldn't keep up with losses. The psychological impact was devastating. German propaganda had spent years telling soldiers that German engineering and German discipline would overcome Allied numerical superiority. The Jeep made that propaganda unbelievable. Here was an Allied vehicle that was both better in practical terms and available in quantities that seemed impossible. If America could produce 600,000 complex four-wheel drive vehicles while also building tanks, aircraft, ships, and every other weapon of war, what did that say about the claims of inevitable German victory? Soviet forces received over 51,000 Jeeps through the Lend-Lease program. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin reportedly expressed more enthusiasm for Jeep deliveries than for almost any other American military aid. When American diplomat W. Averell Harriman met with Stalin in 1941 to discuss Lend-Lease, Stalin initially responded coolly to the list of proposed military aid. But when Harriman mentioned Jeeps, Stalin's demeanor changed. "Good," Stalin said. "I want more. This is a war of motors. The side having the largest number of motors is bound to win." Stalin understood what the German generals would come to understand. Modern warfare was ultimately about industrial capacity. Technical sophistication mattered, but it mattered less than volume. Germany could build a better individual tank than the American Sherman, but America could build 5 Shermans for every German Panther. Germany could design a more efficient reconnaissance vehicle than the Jeep, but America could build 13 Jeeps for every Kübelwagen. The Jeep became emblematic of this industrial disparity. It appeared everywhere Americans fought. Correspondent Ernie Pyle, who spent years reporting from the front lines, wrote that he didn't think America could carry on the war without the Jeep. It was, he said, as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carried twice what it was designed for, and kept going. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, said the Jeep was one of 4 pieces of equipment that won the war for the Allies. The other 3 were the bulldozer, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 transport plane. Each represented the same principle: adequate performance available in overwhelming quantity. General George C. Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff during the war, went further. He called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. This was remarkable praise from a man who oversaw the deployment of thousands of aircraft, hundreds of ships, millions of rifles and machine guns. But Marshall understood that wars are won by logistics as much as by combat. The Jeep solved a fundamental logistical problem: how to move men and materiel quickly over any terrain. It solved that problem so effectively that it changed how armies operated. After the war ended, the Jeep's dominance continued. Allied occupation forces in Germany found themselves inundated with German soldiers and civilians wanting to trade for Jeeps or acquire them as war surplus. German veterans who had spent years driving Kübelwagens would offer multiple German vehicles in exchange for a single Jeep. The vehicle that had been derided as over-engineered American excess had become the most desired piece of military equipment in Europe. American forces discovered abandoned Kübelwagens in good working condition throughout Germany. When they asked German civilians why usable vehicles had been abandoned, the answer was consistent. When Jeeps were available, no one wanted to drive Kübelwagens. Given the choice between German engineering and American production, German soldiers themselves had chosen American production. The U.S. military conducted its own evaluations, comparing the Kübelwagen to the Jeep using vehicles captured in combat. The German vehicle received praise for specific qualities: better fuel economy, simpler maintenance in some respects, more comfortable seating for passengers. But the evaluations consistently concluded that for military purposes, the Jeep was superior. It carried heavier loads. It traversed more difficult terrain. It accepted modifications and field adaptations more readily. Most importantly, it kept working under conditions that would disable other vehicles. The Jeep's story didn't end in 1945. Willys Overland recognized that they had created something with value beyond military applications. In 1945, even before the war ended, they began planning a civilian version. The first model, designated CJ2A for civilian Jeep, appeared in 1946. It was essentially a Willys MB with the military equipment removed and a tailgate added. Willys initially marketed the civilian Jeep as an agricultural vehicle, an alternative to the tractor. Farmers and ranchers were skeptical. The Jeep was too light for heavy draft work, too simple for complex agricultural tasks. But then buyers discovered the vehicle had other uses. It could travel over rough ranch land to check fences and livestock. It could haul supplies to remote work sites. It could serve as general transportation on unpaved rural roads that defeated passenger cars. Sales grew. The Jeep found a market not as a tractor replacement but as a new category of vehicle entirely. A rugged, go-anywhere transportation tool for work that required mobility over difficult terrain. Willys refined the design, adding more comfort and features while retaining the fundamental capability that made the military version successful. The CJ3A appeared in 1949, followed by the CJ3B in 1952, and the CJ5 in 1954. The civilian Jeep spawned an entire industry. Other manufacturers saw the market and created their own versions. Land Rover in Britain, Toyota in Japan, Mahindra in India, all built vehicles inspired by or directly copying the Jeep's basic design. By the 1960s, light four-wheel drive vehicles had become a recognized automotive category. By the 1980s, that category had evolved into the sport utility vehicle, or SUV, which would dominate automotive markets worldwide. The Jeep brand changed hands multiple times. Willys Overland became Kaiser Jeep in 1953. American Motors bought Kaiser Jeep in 1970. Chrysler acquired American Motors in 1987. Fiat merged with Chrysler in 2009. Through all these ownership changes, the Jeep brand persisted and grew. Modern Jeep vehicles look nothing like the original Willys MB, but they trace their lineage directly to that wartime design. The Kübelwagen's story was different. Germany rebuilt after the war, but Ferdinand Porsche focused on sports cars rather than military vehicles. The Volkswagen Beetle became one of the most successful civilian automobiles ever produced, but the Kübelwagen itself disappeared from production. Some remained in service with various military forces for a few years after the war, but by the early 1950s, most had been scrapped or sold as surplus. Today, surviving Kübelwagens are collector's items. Museums display them as examples of German wartime engineering. Enthusiasts restore them with the same care they give to other historic vehicles. But they exist as curiosities, reminders of a lost era, not as the progenitors of an ongoing vehicle category. The contrast is stark. The German vehicle that was supposedly superior on paper became a historical footnote. The American vehicle that was supposedly inferior became the foundation for an entire automotive category that now sells millions of units annually worldwide. This reversal illuminates something fundamental about the nature of engineering and warfare. Theoretical superiority means nothing if it can't be produced in adequate quantities. A vehicle that is 10% better in every measurable category, but available in 1/10 the numbers, is not actually superior, it's inadequate. The Wehrmacht learned this lesson painfully throughout the war, not just with vehicles but with tanks, aircraft, and small arms. German engineers created weapons that were often technically superior to Allied equivalents. But German factories couldn't produce enough of them, and German logistics couldn't keep them supplied and maintained in the field. The Jeep succeeded not because it was the best vehicle any engineer could design, but because it was the best vehicle that could be mass-produced in the quantities required for modern industrial warfare. It balanced performance with manufacturability. It accepted compromises: weight, fuel economy, complexity that made it practical to build in enormous numbers. Those compromises turned out to be irrelevant because having enough adequate vehicles was infinitely more valuable than having a few superior ones. German soldiers understood this instinctively. They didn't care that the Kübelwagen achieved better fuel economy or that its air-cooled engine was theoretically less vulnerable. They cared that when they needed transportation, American forces had Jeeps available while German forces had shortages. They cared that captured Jeeps kept working despite abuse that would destroy Kübelwagens. They cared that Jeeps could carry heavier loads, climb steeper hills, and perform more diverse roles than their own vehicles. This understanding spread through the Wehrmacht like a virus, undermining faith in German technical superiority. If the Americans could build a better vehicle despite their supposedly inferior engineering, what did that say about German tanks, German aircraft, German small arms? The Jeep became tangible proof that German propaganda about technical superiority was false. More corrosively, it proved that American industrial capacity wasn't just greater in scale but qualitatively different in its effects. By 1944, German soldiers who had fought against American forces for years developed a gallows humor about American equipment. They would joke that Americans didn't fight wars, they manufactured victory. The Jeep was central to these jokes. There were so many Jeeps that Americans seemingly gave them away. There were so many Jeeps that American soldiers would destroy their own vehicles rather than let them fall into German hands, knowing replacements would arrive momentarily. There were so many Jeeps that some German soldiers genuinely believed each American soldier had been issued a personal vehicle. This last belief, though factually wrong, captured an emotional truth. The disparity in mechanization between American and German forces was so vast that it seemed to overwhelm normal military logic. An American infantry division had over 2,000 vehicles. A German infantry division had perhaps 400. And by late 1944, many divisions operated with far fewer due to losses and supply shortages. When German soldiers saw American units with Jeeps for every conceivable purpose, with vehicles in reserve, with transportation to spare, it must have felt like fighting against an enemy who operated under different physical laws. The Jeep's ubiquity sent a message more powerful than any propaganda. America had resources to spare. An army that could afford to assign individual Jeeps to radio teams, to medical units, to individual headquarters staff officers, was an army whose logistics were fundamentally different from Germany's. German soldiers had to walk more often than they rode. American soldiers rode more often than they walked. That difference compounded every advantage America already possessed in firepower, air support, and numbers. Looking back from the perspective of decades, it's easy to see Operation Greif as almost comically doomed. The idea that German commandos in American uniforms could infiltrate Allied lines and seize critical objectives required more than language skills and captured equipment. It required that Allied forces be so disorganized and so casual about security that soldiers wouldn't notice imposters. But American forces, by December 1944, were well-trained, well-equipped, and highly alert after months of combat. The operation's failure was overdetermined. But what's remarkable is that Skorzeny tried it at all, using jeeps as the critical enabling equipment. He was Germany's most accomplished special operations commander. He had resources and personnel that most German units could only dream of obtaining, and he concluded that his best chance of success required using American vehicles because German vehicles wouldn't suffice. That calculation reveals everything about the jeep's dominance. Even in deception, even in infiltration, German officers believed American equipment was superior. After the war, Ferdinand Porsche faced prosecution for war crimes related to his use of forced labor during vehicle production. He was imprisoned for 20 months, then released. He returned to designing automobiles, founding Porsche AG, and creating sports cars that would become legendary. The Kübelwagen became a footnote in his biography, interesting primarily because it demonstrated his engineering versatility, not because it was particularly successful or influential. Willys Overland faced no such complications. The company transitioned smoothly from military to civilian production. The Jeep brand became their primary asset, eventually becoming more valuable than the company itself. When American Motors bought Kaiser Jeep in 1970, they were essentially buying the brand and its customer loyalty. When Chrysler bought American Motors in 1987, they wanted the Jeep brand specifically. Other assets from the merger were shed or closed within years. The Jeep brand persisted and thrived. This longevity reflects the original design's fundamental soundness. The basic configuration, a body-on-frame construction, solid axles, front and rear, four-wheel drive, and a powerful engine relative to vehicle weight proved adaptable to generations of improvements. Modern Jeep Wranglers retain these core elements while adding features the wartime MB couldn't accommodate: independent front suspension for better road manners, powerful engines for highway speeds, electronic controls for terrain management. But the basic concept remains: a vehicle that can go anywhere and do anything. The Kübelwagen's design philosophy, lightweight, minimal power, two-wheel drive, maximum efficiency, didn't transfer to the civilian market successfully. It was a solution to a specific problem: the need for a reconnaissance vehicle under wartime resource constraints that had no peacetime equivalent. When those constraints vanished, so did the Kübelwagen's advantages. Buyers wanted power, capability, and comfort. The Jeep could provide all three. The Kübelwagen couldn't evolve to meet those demands. Consider the final irony. The Jeep exists today as a brand worth billions of dollars, producing hundreds of thousands of vehicles annually, owned by Stellantis, one of the world's largest automotive corporations. The Kübelwagen exists as a historical curiosity, with surviving examples worth significant money to collectors precisely because so few remain and because they represent a lost alternative to the Jeep's dominance. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.